You ever watch someone destroy their own career in under 60 seconds? The voice wasn't loud, but it carried, cutting through the late afternoon heat as traffic crawled past at barely 20 miles an hour and a small crowd began to gather along the sidewalk, drawn not by sirens, not by chaos, but by something quieter, something sharper, a uniform raised in authority and a woman who refused to shrink beneath it. Officer Daniel Brooks stood tall, shoulders squared, his badge catching the sun like it was meant to be seen, his voice firm, controlled, but laced with something colder as he pointed toward Naomi Carter standing just a few feet away. "I asked you a question," he said, louder this time, making sure everyone heard, making sure the moment belonged to him. And around them phones lifted, whispers spread, the kind of attention that feeds a man who believes control is his by right. But Naomi didn't react the way he expected. She didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even shift her stance. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, like she was listening to something deeper than his words, like the noise around them didn't quite reach her. And that stillness, that quiet refusal to engage, it unsettled something in the air, even if no one could name it yet. "You don't just stand around here without a reason," Daniel continued, pacing a step closer, his boots echoing faintly against the pavement, his tone sharper now, pushing, pressing, testing. "And if you were standing there, watching it unfold, you'd feel it too, that tension building under your skin, that instinct telling you something wasn't lining up the way it should, because she didn't look lost, she didn't look nervous, she didn't look like someone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She looked like someone waiting, and that difference, that subtle shift, it hung in the space between them like a question no one dared to ask. A black SUV idled quietly half a block away, unnoticed by most, its windows tinted, its presence blending into the background of a city that never stopped moving. But inside, eyes were watching, listening, tracking every word, every movement, every second ticking by. Daniel didn't see it, didn't feel it, because in his mind this was simple, a routine stop, a moment of authority, a reminder of who held the power here. He gestured again, impatience creeping in. "AD," he said, shorter now, sharper, like the word itself carried weight. And for a brief second, Naomi's gaze shifted, not away, but through him, as if something had just aligned in a way only she understood. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, not reaching for panic, not reaching for defense, just a measured motion that made the air tighten. And somewhere behind Daniel, faint but unmistakable, a radio crackled to life, a voice cutting in, distorted, urgent, repeating a name that didn't belong to the moment he thought he controlled. Naomi Carter. And just like that, the ground beneath certainty began to shift. The sound of the radio did not belong to the moment Daniel thought he controlled. It cut through the air like something out of place, sharp and deliberate, repeating her name again. Naomi Carter. And for the first time his expression shifted, not fully, not enough for the crowd to notice, but enough to create a crack in the certainty he had been holding on to just seconds before. He reached for his shoulder radio instinctively, pressing it closer as if proximity could restore control. "Dispatch." "Repeat that," he said, his tone still firm but no longer effortless. And around them the street seemed to slow, the hum of engines, the shuffle of footsteps. Even the whispers from the small gathering of onlookers softened into a quiet tension, the kind that builds when something unseen begins to surface. Naomi remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, her eyes locked on him with a calm that did not match the situation he believed he was managing. And if you were standing there, you would feel it, that subtle shift, that moment when authority starts to question itself without admitting it out loud. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to cooperate," Daniel continued, trying to re-establish rhythm, trying to bring the moment back under his command. But the words landed differently now, heavier, uncertain, as if even he could hear the difference. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in defiance, not in submission, but in recognition, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment, that exact crack in the surface. "Officer," she said quietly, her voice steady, controlled, carrying just enough to reach him without feeding the crowd. "You might want to listen more carefully." And that was it. No raised tone, no urgency. Just a statement that felt out of proportion to the situation unless you understood something he did not. The radio crackled again, louder this time, more urgent, a second voice cutting in, layered over the first, instructions forming, pieces of a reality Daniel had not yet seen, and somewhere behind him a second patrol car slowed, not rushing in, not escalating, just positioning. As if responding to something larger than a simple stop, Daniel glanced briefly over his shoulder, just a fraction of a second. But it was enough for the crowd to sense it, enough for the energy to shift, because power is not only what is said, it is what is felt. And right now what they felt was uncertainty. Naomi's gaze followed that brief movement, not surprised, not reactive, just confirming something already known, her hand lowered back to her side, empty, unthreatening, deliberate, and the black SUV down the block adjusted its position by a few feet, subtle, precise, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Daniel turned back to her, his jaw tightening slightly, trying to anchor himself in procedure and training. In the rules he understood, stay where you are, he said, but the command no longer carried the same weight. It no longer filled the space the way it had moments ago, because something had changed, something he could not yet define. And as the radio spoke her name again, clearer now, more direct, the question was no longer who she was. The question was why everyone else seemed to know before he did. Daniel Brooks had spent years trusting his instincts, the kind that told him when something felt off, when a situation needed control, when a presence did not belong. But this was different. This was not a gut feeling. This was something quieter and far more dangerous. Something slipping through the cracks of what he thought he understood. The radio in his hand buzzed again, sharper now, clearer. All units stand by, do not engage. The voice said, firm, unmistakable, and for a second Daniel did not respond, not because he did not hear it, but because it did not make sense, not in this context, not in this moment. He looked back at Naomi, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the surface details he had judged in seconds, but at the way she stood. The way her eyes held his without challenge yet without hesitation, the kind of presence that does not ask for authority because it already has it. And if you were standing there, you would feel that shift too, that realization creeping in slow and heavy, that maybe this was never about control at all. Dispatch, confirm, he said again, his voice lower now, tighter, and the reply came almost immediately. Officer Brooks, step back and hold position. And that was the moment where procedure no longer aligned with pride, where training collided with reality, and behind him the second patrol car had fully stopped. The officer inside did not rush out, did not intervene, just waited, watching, as if aware of something Daniel was only beginning to grasp. Naomi took a single step forward, not aggressive, not sudden, just enough to close the space between them by a few inches. And even that small movement carried weight. Her voice when she spoke was calm, measured, almost gentle. You are not the one in control here, she said, and there was no threat in it, no emotion meant to provoke, just truth stated plainly, the kind that does not need to be proven because it already exists. Daniel felt it before he understood it, that subtle collapse of certainty, the way the moment he thought he owned was no longer his to direct. His grip tightened slightly around the radio, not in fear, but in the instinct to hold on to something familiar, something structured, something that still made sense. But the world around him was shifting too fast. The black SUV door opened quietly in the distance. One figure stepped out, then another, both dressed in dark suits, moving with purpose, but without urgency, the kind of movement that signals authority without announcing it. And suddenly the crowd was no longer just watching. They were witnessing, phones still raised but now steadier, quieter, as if everyone could feel that something significant was unfolding, something larger than a single confrontation on a city street. Daniel's eyes flicked toward the approaching figures, then back to Naomi. And in that brief exchange of glances the truth settled in deeper, heavier, because nothing about this was random anymore. Nothing about her presence here was accidental. And as the radio spoke one more time, this time using a title instead of a name, the final piece clicked into place, not with noise, not with force, but with a silence so complete it drowned out everything else. Pentagon intelligence, confirmed visual, and in that instant, Daniel Brooks understood that the moment he had been controlling was never his to begin with. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and undeniable, and in that stillness the entire street seemed to hold its breath, the two figures in dark suits approaching with measured steps, not hurried, not uncertain, but precise, like they had already seen this moment play out long before it happened. Daniel Brooks felt the shift fully now, not as confusion, not as doubt, but as realization. The kind that arrives too late to stop what has already begun. One of the agents stopped a few feet behind Naomi, his posture straight, his gaze fixed not on her, but on Daniel, assessing, confirming, while the second agent spoke quietly into a concealed microphone, relaying details that no longer needed explanation. Naomi did not turn to acknowledge them. She did not need to. Her authority was not in display, it was in presence, and that presence now filled the space that Daniel had once occupied so confidently. "Step back, officer," the first agent said, his voice calm but absolute, not raised, not aggressive, just final. And it was not the tone that carried weight, it was the certainty behind it, the kind that does not expect resistance because it already knows the outcome. Daniel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, caught between instinct and instruction, between the role he had played moments ago and the reality unfolding in front of him. And if you were standing there, you would feel that hesitation, that invisible line being crossed, the moment where control does not slip, it is taken, quietly, completely. Daniel lowered his hand from the radio, the gesture small but significant. His voice when he spoke was no longer commanding, no longer sharp, it was measured, searching for ground that was no longer there. "I was conducting a routine stop," he said, the words sounding different now, thinner, as if even he could hear the gap between intention and impact. Naomi finally turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the agents behind her, then back to Daniel, her expression unchanged, her voice steady. "And now you are part of something else," she replied, not accusatory, not emotional, just factual. The kind of statement that redraws the boundaries of a moment without raising its volume. The crowd had grown quieter, the earlier whispers replaced by a focused silence, phones still recording, but now held with a different awareness, not capturing conflict, but witnessing consequence. The second patrol officer remained by his vehicle, watching, not intervening, understanding that whatever this was, it had moved beyond standard procedure. The black SUV now sat with its doors open. Another figure visible inside, monitoring, coordinating, a network operating in plain sight that Daniel had not seen until it was too late. The agent stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Daniel and Naomi without aggression, just enough to establish order. "You were given clear instructions," he said, not as a reprimand, but as a confirmation of fact, and Daniel nodded once, slowly, the motion carrying more weight than any words he could offer, because in that moment, acknowledgement was all that remained. Naomi took a breath, calm, controlled, the kind of breath that signals not relief, but transition. And as she looked at Daniel one last time, there was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only a quiet clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, and exactly how quickly everything can change. Because he thought he was managing a situation, but the truth was, the situation had been managing him all along. The street did not return to normal, not right away, because moments like this do not simply end. They settle, they linger, they force everyone present to recalibrate what they thought they understood. Daniel Brooks stood there with his shoulders still squared, but no longer rigid, no longer certain. The badge on his chest catching the same sunlight, but carrying a different weight now. One defined not by authority but by consequence. The agent closest to him remained calm, watchful, not escalating, not demeaning, just present in a way that made it clear the situation had moved beyond him entirely. Naomi Carter shifted her gaze briefly toward the black SUV, a subtle acknowledgement, and in response one of the figures inside nodded almost imperceptibly, a silent exchange that spoke volumes without drawing attention. This was never chaos. This was coordination, precise and controlled, unfolding exactly as it needed to. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when the mind begins to catch up with reality. "I did not have all the information," he said, The words careful, deliberate, not defensive, but searching for footing in a moment that no longer offered it. Naomi listened without interruption, her expression steady, neither softening nor hardening, simply present, absorbing the statement without reacting to it. And that lack of reaction said more than any response could, because this was not about correcting him. It was about revealing something deeper, something structural, something that could not be undone with a single explanation. That is exactly the problem, she replied after a brief pause, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough weight to settle over the moment like a final layer. And if you were standing there, you would feel it, not as accusation, but as truth, the kind that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. The second agent stepped slightly closer, not to intervene, but to formalize what was already understood. Officer Brooks, you are being instructed to step away and await further direction, he said, the tone neutral, procedural, yet unmistakably firm. Daniel nodded once, a small motion, but one that marked the complete shift from command to compliance. He took a single step back, then another, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, the distance between who he believed he was in that moment and what he had become within it. The crowd remained silent. The earlier curiosity replaced by something more reflective, more aware, as if everyone present had just witnessed more than an encounter. They had witnessed a lesson, one that did not need to be explained because it was already understood on a deeper level. Naomi turned slightly, her attention no longer centered on Daniel, but on the broader operation still quietly unfolding around them, her presence shifting from focal point to command center without any visible transition. And that was the final realization, the one that settled in slowly but completely. She had never been reacting to the situation. She had been managing it from the beginning. Daniel stood at the edge of the moment now, no longer at its center, his radio silent in his hand, his voice unneeded. And as the agents continued their quiet coordination, as the SUV door closed with a soft, controlled motion, as the street began to breathe again, one truth remained, clear and undeniable. Authority is not about who speaks the loudest. It is about who never needed to raise their voice at all. The crowd did not disperse immediately because something deeper had taken root in that moment, something that lingered beneath the surface long after the voices had quieted and the tension had eased. Naomi Carter stood still for just a second longer, not because she needed to, but because she understood the weight of what had just unfolded, not just for the officer, but for everyone who had watched, every person holding a phone, every quiet observer who had witnessed authority shift without a single raised hand. And then she moved, not hurried, not dramatic, just a calm step forward as if returning to a path she had never truly left. One of the agents fell in a step beside her, speaking in a low voice, measured and precise, updating her on details that had nothing to do with the scene the crowd believed they had just witnessed, because what they saw was only the surface. Beneath it, something far more complex was still in motion. Daniel Brooks remained where he had stepped back to, his posture no longer rigid but not collapsed either, just altered, like a structure that had been forced to reconsider its foundation. His eyes followed her for a brief moment, not out of defiance, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, the kind that arrives when a person finally sees beyond their own assumptions. And if you were standing there, you would feel that shift inside yourself too, that quiet question forming. How many times had moments like this passed unnoticed? How many times had certainty spoken louder than understanding? The second patrol officer finally stepped forward, not rushing, not intervening, just placing himself beside Daniel in a way that did not challenge, but did not ignore either. A silent acknowledgement that things had changed, that something larger than either of them had just drawn a line neither could cross back over. The radio on Daniel's shoulder remained silent now. No instructions, no corrections, just the absence of noise where certainty once lived. Naomi reached the black SUV, the door already open, the interior shadowed but controlled. She paused for a fraction of a second before stepping in, not to look back, not to confirm anything, because there was nothing left to confirm. Everything that needed to be understood had already been revealed. The agent beside her gave a brief nod, and the door closed with a soft, final sound, the kind that does not demand attention but carries meaning all the same. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, merging into the slow movement of traffic as if it had always been part of it. Unnoticed, unremarkable, and yet everything about it had just altered the course of a single moment in a way that could not be. Undone, Daniel exhaled again, slower this time, deeper, as the street began to return to its rhythm, cars moving, voices rising again, the world continuing as it always does. But something had shifted, not just around him, but within him, because authority without awareness is fragile, and once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. He looked down briefly, then back up, the space where she had stood now empty but not forgotten, and in that quiet aftermath, one realization settled in with absolute clarity. The loudest voice in the moment is not always the one that holds the power. Sometimes the real power is the one that never needed to prove it at all. The city did not remember her, not the way it should have, because moments like that rarely leave marks on concrete or glass. They settle somewhere quieter, somewhere harder to measure. And as the black SUV disappeared into traffic, Naomi Carter was already focused on what came next, her attention shifting seamlessly from the street to the operation unfolding across multiple blocks. Screens inside the vehicle flickering with live feeds, coordinates updating in real time, voices calm and precise, through secure channels. And if you could see it from her perspective, you would understand that the encounter outside was never the mission. It was only a ripple in something much larger. "We are back on track," one of the agents said, his tone steady, and Naomi nodded once, her eyes scanning the data without hesitation, without distraction, because control for her was never about the moment. It was about the system surrounding it. Back on the street, Daniel Brooks remained still for a few seconds longer than necessary, not frozen, not lost, just processing, the kind of silence that follows when the world shifts in a way you did not expect. The second officer beside him finally spoke, his voice low, careful. "You all right?" he asked, not as a challenge, not as a judgment, just as a recognition of what had just happened. Daniel nodded slowly, the motion small but honest. "Yeah," he replied, though the word carried more weight than it usually would, because being all right did not mean being unchanged. The crowd had begun to disperse now, the energy fading, conversations restarting, but the glances lingered, the subtle looks that said something had been seen, something that could not be fully explained but would not be forgotten either. Daniel adjusted his stance, his hand brushing lightly against his badge, not out of habit, but out of awareness, a reminder of what it represented and how easily that meaning could shift depending on who was looking. If you were standing there, you might wonder what happens after a moment like that, whether it fades, whether it gets buried under routine, whether it becomes just another story no one tells out loud. But the truth is, moments like that do not disappear. They follow you, not loudly, not constantly, but in quiet ways, in the pause before you speak, in the second thought before you act, in the awareness that not everything is what it seems at first glance. Daniel turned toward his patrol car, each step measured, not heavy, not rushed, just deliberate, the kind of movement that comes when a person is no longer acting on instinct alone. The radio remained silent as he reached for the door, and in that silence there was space, space to think, space to reconsider, space to understand something that had been invisible before. Somewhere across the city, Naomi's vehicle slowed near an intersection, her gaze lifting briefly from the screen to the passing streets outside, not searching, not reflecting, just observing. Because for her, this was not about one officer or one moment. It was about patterns, about systems, about the quiet intersections where assumption meets reality and one inevitably reshapes the other. She looked forward again, focused, composed, already moving beyond what had happened. While behind her, on a street that looked like any other, a man stood beside his car, realizing that sometimes the most important lesson is not the one you are taught, but the one you are forced to see for yourself. The operation did not slow down just because the street had returned to normal, because for Naomi Carter, normal was only the surface layer of something far more intricate. The black SUV moved steadily through the city at a controlled pace, never rushing, never drawing attention, blending into traffic like any other vehicle on a late afternoon. But inside, the atmosphere was focused, precise. Every screen lit with information that shifted by the second, small indicators, moving dots, fragments of a larger pattern coming together in real time. Target is approaching the intersection in less than 2 minutes. One agent said quietly, his voice measured, and Naomi nodded, her attention locked onto the display, her mind already several steps ahead, mapping outcomes, calculating risks, adjusting without hesitation. Because this was where her authority truly existed, not in confrontation, not in presence, but in control over variables most people never even noticed. And if you could see it from her perspective, you would understand that what happened on that street was not an interruption, it was a test, a moment that revealed how quickly perception could collapse under pressure. Back where it had all started, Daniel Brooks sat inside his patrol car now, the engine idling softly, the world outside moving as if nothing had happened, but inside, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make everything feel slightly different. His hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, but not rigid, his eyes forward, but unfocused for a brief moment, replaying the scene not in images, but in realization, the words, the tone, the assumptions, each piece settling into place in a way they had not before. The second officer had already returned to his own vehicle, leaving Daniel alone with the quiet. And that quiet was heavier than any noise, because it left no room for distraction, only reflection. And if you were sitting there, you would feel it too, that subtle discomfort, not from what happened, but from what it revealed, the idea that certainty can be misplaced, that authority without awareness is incomplete. Daniel reached for the radio, not urgently, not instinctively, but deliberately. His voice when he spoke was different now, controlled in a new way. "Dispatch, status update," he said. And even that simple request carried a shift, less assumption, more awareness, less certainty, more consideration. The reply came back routine, normal, as if the system itself had already moved on. But Daniel had not completely, because moments like that do not reset with a radio call. They stay, shaping the way you see the next situation, the next person, the next decision. Across the city, the SUV slowed again, turning smoothly onto a narrower street, the environment changing, quieter, less crowded, but the focus inside remained the same. Naomi leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing just enough to signal attention sharpening. "We are close," she said, her voice calm. And the agents responded instantly, movements coordinated, silent, efficient, because here, every second mattered, not emotionally, not dramatically, but strategically. And as the vehicle came to a controlled stop, Naomi took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to transition from observation to action, from one layer of control to the next, because while one story had just ended on a city street, another was already unfolding, one that no crowd would witness, no phones would record, and no one outside that vehicle would ever fully understand. While behind her, miles away, a single officer sat in his car, realizing that sometimes the most important shift does not happen in the world around you. It happens in the way you choose to see it. The vehicle came to a complete stop, but inside, nothing paused, because this was not the kind of moment that allowed hesitation. Naomi Carter stepped out first, her movements controlled, deliberate, her eyes already scanning the environment not for danger, but for alignment. The quiet street stretched ahead with an almost deceptive calm, a row of buildings casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower, and if you were standing there, you might think nothing significant was about to happen. But that is the nature of operations like this. They exist beneath perception, in the space where ordinary meets unseen precision. "Positions," one agent said softly, and within seconds the team dispersed, not dramatically, not noticeably, just enough to create coverage without drawing attention. Naomi remained near the vehicle for a brief moment, her focus narrowing as information from the last few minutes settled into a clear picture. The earlier encounter replayed in fragments, not as distraction, but as data, because for her, every interaction mattered. Every unexpected variable had a place in the larger structure, and that was the difference. While others reacted to moments, she integrated them, refined them, used them to sharpen what came next. Across the city, Daniel Brooks had finally pulled away from the curb, the patrol car moving at a steady 30 miles per hour, blending back into routine traffic, but routine no longer felt the same. His eyes moved differently now, not scanning for threats, but observing with a deeper Awareness, the people on the sidewalks, the drivers and passing cars, each one no longer just a possibility to assess, but a presence to understand, and if you were in his position, you would feel that shift too, subtle but undeniable, the difference between seeing and actually noticing. His radio remained quiet except for standard updates, but even those sounded different now, less like commands, more like pieces of a system he was only beginning to truly recognize. Back on the quiet street, Naomi took a step forward, her attention locking onto a single building halfway down the block. Unremarkable on the surface, just another structure among many. But beneath that surface was the reason they were there, the real objective that had been unfolding long before the moment on the street ever happened. "We are in position," another agent confirmed through a secure channel, and Naomi nodded once, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly, not tense, not urgent, just ready, because readiness for her was not a reaction. It was a constant state. The door to the building opened briefly. A figure stepped out, paused, looked around with the casual glance of someone who believed they were unseen, and then moved forward. And in that instant, everything aligned, not with noise, not with chaos, but with precision. Naomi's voice came through calm and steady. "Now." And the team responded without hesitation, moving in coordinated silence, each step calculated, each action part of a larger design that required no explanation, because every person involved already understood their role, their timing, their purpose, and as the operation unfolded exactly as intended, one truth remained constant. Control is not about the moment people see. It is about the moments they never even realize are happening. Miles away, Daniel slowed at a red light, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze forward, but his thoughts quieter now, more focused, because sometimes the most important realization is not what you encounter, it is what you carry forward from it. And while he could not see what was happening across the city, he had already become part of something larger, not through action, but through understanding, because the moment that changed him was never meant to be seen as the end. It was only the beginning of a perspective he could no longer ignore. The moment unfolded without spectacle, without raised voices or sudden movement, because the most controlled operations never announce themselves. They simply happen. Naomi Carter stood just outside the line of motion, her eyes tracking every detail as her team moved with quiet precision. The figure who had stepped out of the building never saw it coming, not because it was hidden, but because it was designed to be invisible within the normal flow of a city that never stops. And if you were standing across the street, you would not notice anything unusual, just people walking, doors opening, cars passing at 25 miles per hour, life continuing exactly as expected. But within that ordinary rhythm, everything had already shifted, confirmed. One agent said softly through the channel, his voice steady, controlled, and Naomi nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, because confirmation was not the end. It was the transition, the point where observation becomes outcome. She stepped forward now, not into chaos, but into resolution, her presence calm, her pace measured, the building behind the operation now just another structure in a long row of similar ones, its significance already absorbed into the system she managed, because for her, success was not defined by what people saw, it was defined by what never needed to be seen at all. Across the city, Daniel Brooks turned onto a quieter road, the traffic thinning, the noise of the earlier moment replaced by a steady, almost reflective silence. His hands remained steady on the wheel, but his thoughts moved differently now, slower, more deliberate, not searching for answers, but processing what had already been revealed. The radio crackled briefly with routine updates, nothing urgent, nothing out of the ordinary, and yet even those familiar sounds carried a new weight, a reminder that the system he operated within was larger, more complex, and far more layered than he had allowed himself to see before. And if you were in that seat, you would feel it too. That quiet recalibration, the shift from reacting to understanding, from assumption to awareness. Back at the operation, Naomi paused for a brief moment, her gaze lifting from the immediate surroundings to the broader picture forming in her mind, every movement, every signal, every response fitting together into a structure that did not rely on chance, but on design. "We are done here," she said calmly, her voice carrying through the channel without urgency, because completion for her was not dramatic. It was expected. The agents responded with the same quiet efficiency, dispersing, resetting, leaving no trace of the precision that had just unfolded. The black SUV remained waiting, its engine running smoothly, ready to move the moment she stepped inside. Naomi took one last look at the street, not to reflect, not to question, but to confirm what she already knew, that everything had aligned exactly as it needed to. And then she turned and entered the vehicle, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the moment without marking it. As the SUV pulled away, merging once again into the steady rhythm of the city, the operation disappeared into the background where it belonged, unseen, unrecorded, but fully realized. Miles away, Daniel slowed as he approached another intersection, the red light ahead forcing a pause. And in that pause, he understood something he had not fully grasped before, that power is not always visible, that authority is not always loud, and that sometimes the most important moments are the ones that quietly reshape the way you see everything that comes after. The city continued as it always did, steady and indifferent, but beneath that surface something had already concluded, something precise and final that would never appear on any headline or pass through any public conversation. Naomi Carter sat inside the moving vehicle now, her posture relaxed but her focus unchanged, a tablet resting lightly in her hand as lines of data updated in real time. Confirmations, timestamps, silent acknowledgments that the objective had been secured without disruption, without exposure, exactly as designed. One of the agents across from her glanced up briefly. "All channels are clear," he said, his voice calm, and Naomi gave a small nod, not as approval, but as recognition that the system had functioned as it should, because for her, success was never emotional. It was structural. It was the quiet alignment of countless details that no one outside the operation would ever notice. And if you could see it from her perspective, you would understand that the earlier moment on the street was already behind her, not dismissed, but absorbed, integrated into a larger understanding that never stopped evolving. Across town, Daniel Brooks turned into the station parking lot, the familiar sight of concrete lines and parked vehicles grounding him in something known, something routine. But even routine carried a different tone now. He parked the car slowly, the engine idling for a second longer than usual before he turned it off, the sudden silence inside the vehicle more noticeable than before. He sat there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but reflection, the kind that does not demand attention but refuses to be ignored. And if you were in that seat, you would recognize it, that subtle shift where experience becomes awareness, where a single moment reshapes the way you approach the next one. He stepped out of the car and closed the door with a quiet, controlled motion, his eyes scanning the lot not out of habit, but with intention, noticing details he might have overlooked before. The way people moved, the way space was shared, the way assumptions could form before facts ever had a chance to settle. Inside the vehicle, Naomi set the tablet aside, her gaze lifting briefly toward the passing skyline visible through the tinted window, not searching, not reflecting, just observing. Because for her, perspective was not something that came and went, it was constant, a foundation that shaped every decision long before it needed to be made. "Debrief in 10 minutes, another agent said, and she nodded once, already preparing, already organizing the information into something useful, something actionable, because even after completion, the process continued. Refinement, evaluation, adjustment, the quiet work that ensures the next operation unfolds with even greater precision. Back at the station, Daniel walked toward the entrance, his steps steady, his posture unchanged to anyone watching. But internally something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to alter the way he carried himself, the way he thought, the way he would act the next time a situation placed him in control, because now he understood something he had not before. That control without awareness is incomplete, that authority without understanding is fragile, and that the difference between the two is not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it is revealed in a single moment that forces you to see beyond what you thought you knew. And as the door closed behind him and the day continued like any other, one truth remained, quiet but permanent. The most powerful lessons are not the ones you are told. They are the ones you are shown when you least expect it. The room was quiet in a way that only controlled environments ever are, not silent, but precise, every sound intentional, every movement measured. Naomi Carter stood at the head of the table as the debrief began, the soft glow of screens reflecting against composed faces, agents seated with focused attention, not waiting to speak, but ready to process, to refine, to improve, because for them, completion was never the end. It was the beginning of understanding what could be done better next time. Naomi's voice carried calmly across the room, steady and clear. Timeline, she said, and immediately one of the agents began outlining each phase, each transition, each moment aligned with exact timestamps. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a seamless reconstruction of an operation that had unfolded exactly as intended. And if you were there, you would notice something different, something subtle. No one spoke about the street. No one mentioned the confrontation, not because it was irrelevant, but because it had already been categorized, processed, placed within the broader system as a variable that had been accounted for and resolved. Naomi listened without interruption, her eyes steady, absorbing every detail, not searching for mistakes, but for patterns. Because patterns were where true control lived, not in individual moments, but in the way those moments connected. Across town, Daniel Brooks sat at his desk, the familiar hum of the station surrounding him, keyboards clicking, radios murmuring, conversations blending into the background. Everything exactly as it had always been, and yet not quite the same. He leaned back slightly in his chair, a report open in front of him, the words clear, structured, procedural, but his focus drifted for a moment, not away from the work, but deeper into it. The earlier encounter still present, not as distraction, but as context, the kind that reshapes how information is understood, how decisions are made. And if you were in his place, you would recognize that shift, that quiet recalibration where instinct is no longer enough, where awareness begins to take its place beside it. Naomi stepped forward slightly, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, not out of habit, but presence. Adjust the entry timing by 3 seconds next time, she said, her tone calm, precise, and immediately notes were taken, not questioned, not debated, because trust in that room was not built on authority alone. It was built on results, on consistency, on the quiet confidence that came from knowing every decision was backed by understanding. One of the agents glanced up briefly. And the external variable, he asked, not naming it, not needing to. And Naomi met his gaze for a moment before responding. Handled, she said simply, and that was enough, because in that single word was an entire sequence of events, processed, resolved, and filed away as part of the system's ongoing refinement. Back at the station, Daniel closed the report slowly, his movements deliberate, thoughtful, the weight of the day settling into something more than routine, something that would not simply fade into memory. He looked around the room, the people, the process, the structure, all familiar, all unchanged, and yet he saw it differently now, not just as a system to operate within, but as one to understand more deeply, more carefully. Because now he knew that what you see is not always the full picture, that authority is not always where it appears to be, and that sometimes the most important part of a moment is not what happens on the surface, but what it reveals underneath. And as Naomi concluded the debrief with a simple nod, the room already shifting into preparation for what came next, one truth remained clear, quiet, and unshakable. The difference between power and perception is not in how loudly it is expressed, but in how deeply it is understood. The room gradually emptied, not with noise or finality, but with quiet purpose, each person moving on to the next task, as if nothing extraordinary had just been completed, because in their world, precision was expected, not celebrated. Naomi Carter remained for a moment longer, standing by the window as the city stretched out beneath the fading light. Cars moving in steady lines, people crossing streets, life continuing in its familiar rhythm. And if you looked from that height, you would never know how many unseen decisions shaped what appeared to be ordinary. She did not reflect on the confrontation, not in the way most would. There was no replay, no lingering emotion, only clarity, because for her, every moment had already been understood the second it happened, already placed into a structure that allowed her to move forward without hesitation. Across town, Daniel Brooks stepped out of the station into the cool evening air, the sky shifting into deeper shades as streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long reflections across the pavement. He paused for a brief second, not because he needed to, but because something in him had changed in a way that did not demand attention but could not be ignored. The day had ended like any other. Reports filed, calls completed, routine maintained. And yet beneath that routine something had shifted, not in the world around him, but in the way he understood his place within it. And if you were standing there, you would feel it too. That quiet awareness that does not fade when the moment passes, but stays, shaping the way you see what comes next. He looked out across the street, watching as people moved past without noticing him, without knowing anything about what had happened hours earlier. And for the first time, he did not assume what they were. He observed, he considered, he allowed space for the possibility that there was always more beneath the surface than what appeared at first glance. Naomi turned from the window and walked toward the door, her steps steady, her focus already shifting to what came next, because for her, there was always a next step, another layer, another decision waiting to be made. And that was the difference. She did not hold on to moments. She moved through them, using each one as part of a larger system that never stopped evolving. Daniel exhaled slowly, the air cool against his skin, his posture relaxed but grounded in a way it had not been before, not because he had lost authority, but because he had gained something else, something quieter, something deeper, the understanding that authority alone was never enough, that awareness was what gave it meaning. That respect was not something demanded, but something built through the way you chose to see and treat the world around you. The streetlight above him flickered once before settling into a steady glow, illuminating the space just enough to see clearly. And in that light, one truth settled in with quiet certainty. He had started the day believing he understood control, but by the end of it, he realized control was never about being the loudest voice. It was about knowing when to listen, when to observe, and when to recognize that the person in front of you might be far more than you ever assumed. Because in the end, he thought he was the law, but that day, the law showed him a different